Welcome back, everyone, for another deep dive. Today we're tackling something that's both fascinating and a little bit unnerving. Victimology.
Ooh, that's a good one.
Specifically, we're going to try to unpack how murderers choose their targets. You always hear about how it's random, but is it really?
Well, that's the thing about victimology, right? It's not about pointing fingers at the victim, not at all. It's more about trying to understand why someone might be more likely to be a target. All those different factors that come into play.
So, like, what makes one person more vulnerable than another?
Exactly. It's a bit like, putting together a puzzle, and each piece of that puzzle is a different part of that vulnerability.
Okay, I like that analogy.
Yeah.
So how has this puzzle, this idea of vulnerability, changed over time?
Oh, it's changed a lot, especially if you look back in history. Think about like ancient societies. Often, victims were chosen because of their role in society or their religious beliefs.
So it was less about personal grudges and more about the victim's place in the community.
Yeah, almost like they were chosen as a symbol, like their spiritual significance or their spot in the social hierarchy.
Wow, that's pretty intense. So how did things shift? How did we get to where we are today?
Well, as societies changed, so did the reasons for murder. It became more personal, less about the community, and more about individual motives.
Okay, so fast forward to today. What makes someone a target now? What do murderers look for?
Well, certain things can make someone seem more vulnerable, unfortunately. Things like if they're isolated socially or maybe have low self-esteem or even past trauma.
Because those things might make them seem like an easier target, like they wouldn't fight back as much.
Right. And of course, there's so much more to it than just those things. We have to factor in things like mental health struggles, lifestyle choices, even their relationships. It all kind of mixes together.
Okay, so there's definitely more to it than just randomness. Speaking of nuances, I've always wondered about location. Is there really such a thing as a bad part of town? Does where you live actually matter?
There's a reason some areas get that reputation, for sure. Urban areas tend to have more crime just because there's more anonymity and lots of people packed together, but rural areas, they have their own challenges too.
Right, because crime can happen anywhere.
Exactly. Like take H.H. Holmes, for example. He specifically targeted people visiting Chicago during the World's Fair back in 1893.
Because they were new to the city and didn't really know anyone.
Yeah, they were out of their element, you know, and that made them vulnerable. It's a classic example of how an event or a location can create these opportunities for crime. But it's not all about just individual psychology, right? We have to look at the bigger picture, at the social structures around us.
That makes sense.
Yeah.
Our environment definitely shapes us. So
Yeah.
are you saying that some groups of people are just more at risk than others?
Well, we can't ignore the fact that marginalized groups are often targeted more. Societal attitudes, lack of resources, inequality. All of those things add up.
And economic factors too, I imagine. Poverty, lack of support.
Exactly. All of that contributes to a higher risk. It's kind of like a domino effect. One thing leads to another.
Okay, so it's all connected. And that brings me to something that's been on my mind. The internet.
Mm.
How has social media changed how criminals choose their victims?
Mhm.
It feels like we're all so exposed online.
It is a double-edged sword, no doubt. We're so connected now, but that creates a trail that can be followed, right?
Oh, wow. Yeah.
Like if you overshare personal information online, routines, your feelings, it's like painting a target on your back.
Yeah, it's almost like you're giving someone a map to your life. I even heard about people using those location tags to stalk others. Scary stuff.
It is scary. And then there's all the negativity online. Cyberbullying, harassment, stalking. It might start online, but it can have real consequences. And, as we go deeper into this idea of victimology, we have to talk about forensic evidence. It's really changed how we understand how victims are chosen.
Yeah, that's a good point. It's not just about finding the bad guy, right?
Yeah.
It's about understanding the bigger picture.
Exactly. It's like building a bridge between the actual evidence and the psychology behind the crime.
So how does forensic evidence help us understand why a particular person might become a victim?
Well, a lot of times criminals target people who have certain traits, things that make them seem more vulnerable. It's like they're looking for someone who fits their own, messed up psychology.
So forensic evidence can help us figure out those traits, those common threads that link victims.
Yeah, Exactly. It's about finding those patterns. Like, imagine a bunch of cases where the victims were all really isolated socially. That might tell us that the offender was looking for people who didn't have strong connections.
Because they might not be missed as quickly or wouldn't have anyone to turn to for help.
Sadly, that's often the case. And that's why understanding these profiles is so important. If we can see those patterns, we can start to prevent these crimes from happening.
Right, because knowledge is power.
Yeah.
Okay, so we've talked about psychology, but what about location? We were talking about that earlier.
Location is huge. Forensic evidence can show us where crimes are happening and why. Like, why are certain areas more prone to certain types of crime?
So it's like creating a map, but instead of streets, it's showing us where the danger zones are.
Yeah, exactly. Like a heat map of vulnerability. And that helps investigators figure out where to focus their efforts.
And maybe even prevent future crimes, too.
Right. By understanding how geography and crime are linked, we can make those areas safer. More police, better lighting, that kind of thing.
Okay, that makes sense. So we've got psychology, geography. What about the social aspects? Crime doesn't happen in a bubble, right?
No, definitely not. It's all connected to the social structures around us, the inequality, the power dynamics.
So how does forensic evidence help us see those social influences?
Well, it can show us patterns of victimization that are linked to bigger societal issues. Like, if we see a lot of victims from marginalized groups, it might mean those social and economic disadvantages are making them more vulnerable.
It's like those inequalities create this perfect storm for crime, right?
Right. Yeah, it's sad, but it's true. We have to look at the bigger picture, not just the individual crime itself.
So it's about asking why this is happening, not just who did it. Okay, we've talked about a lot, but we can't forget about technology. It's changed everything, hasn't it?
Oh, absolutely. It's like this digital revolution in crime, both how it happens and how we solve it.
So it's like a race, criminals using technology, and then investigators trying to catch up.
Yeah, you could say that. And the stakes are high. Okay, so let's talk about how technology has changed, how victims are chosen. It's not just about being in the same place anymore, is it?
No, definitely not. With social media, dating apps, and everything else, people can be targeted from anywhere.
Exactly. Criminals can find information, build relationships even, and take advantage of people without even meeting them face to face.
It's like the internet is a hunting ground now.
In a way, yeah. And it's harder to protect people because the danger isn't always obvious.
So what can we do?
Well, we have to start with awareness. We need to think about what we're putting out there online, all that personal information.
Like our routines, where we live, all that.
Yeah, all of that. It's like leaving a trail of breadcrumbs for someone to follow.
Okay, that's a good way to think about it.
Mm.
So awareness is key, but what about on the investigative side? How does technology help solve crimes?
Well, think about all the stuff we leave behind online. Emails, texts, social media posts, even our location data. It's like a gold mine for investigators.
Just like a digital fingerprint, right?
Exactly. And they have all these tools to analyze that data, figure out timelines, motives, all that.
Wow, so technology can be good and bad, I guess.
Definitely. It depends on how you use it. Let's talk about some real life cases, see how all this plays out in the real world.
Yeah, okay, I'm thinking about that case with Megan Meyer. That was so tragic.
It was awful. She was only 13 when she was cyberbullied by an adult pretending to be a teenager.
And it all happened on MySpace, right?
Yep.
It really showed the world how dangerous cyberbullying can be, especially for young people.
Okay, what about a case where digital evidence actually helped solve the crime?
Well, the Meredith Kercher case is a good example.
Mhm.
It happened in Italy, and a young American student was murdered.
Oh, yeah, that was all over the news.
It was a big case, very controversial. But what's interesting is how digital evidence played a big role. Emails, texts, computer activity.
Whoa.
It was all used in the investigation.
So it shows how important that digital evidence can be, but also that it's not always straightforward, right?
Absolutely. It needs to be analyzed carefully. Okay, how about one more case? This one shows how even the smartest criminals can make mistakes with technology.
Okay, lay it on me.
The BTK killer, Dennis Rader. He terrorized Wichita for years.
And he got caught because of a floppy disk, right?
Yep. He thought he'd erased everything, but the police were able to get those deleted files back.
Wow, so you can't really hide anything these days. Okay, so we've seen the dark side of technology, but it can be used for good too, right? Of course. It can help us prevent crimes, support victims, and make communities safer.
So it's all about finding that balance, right?
Exactly. Using technology wisely and being aware of the risks. And that's where situational crime prevention comes in.
Okay, I've heard that term, but break it down for me.
It's basically about stopping crime before it happens, making it harder for criminals to do their thing.
So, like making it harder for them to choose a victim in the first place.
Right. And that means using a bunch of different strategies, like making changes to the environment, making targets harder to hit, and having more surveillance.
So, making things less appealing for criminals, basically.
Exactly. And that's where understanding victimology is so important. Knowing how victims are chosen helps us figure out how to stop it.
Okay, so give me some examples. What are some of the ways this is being used right now?
Okay, let's start with a simple one. Better lighting in public places. It's amazing how much of a difference that can make.
Yeah, it makes sense. Criminals don't want to be seen, right?
Exactly. Darkness is their friend. Okay, another one is target hardening.
I've heard that term before. What does that mean exactly?
Basically making it physically harder to commit a crime.
So things like security systems, better locks, that kind of thing.
Yeah, and even things like landscaping, making it harder to break into a property. It's all about putting up those barriers.
Okay, I get it. And then there's surveillance, right? Cameras and stuff.
Yes, making people feel like they're being watched can be a great deterrent. And surveillance technology has come a long way. Facial recognition, license plate readers. They even have algorithms that can predict where crimes might happen.
Wow, that's both impressive and a little scary. But I guess it can be a powerful tool if it's used responsibly. Okay, so we've talked about technology and physical stuff. What about the social side of crime prevention?
That's where community involvement comes in. Neighborhood watch programs, community policing. It's all about people looking out for each other.
Right, because a strong community is a safer community.
Exactly. When people feel connected and are invested in keeping each other safe, it makes a big difference.
Okay, so give me some examples of how this has worked in the real world.
Okay, there's that famous broken windows theory that was used in New York City.
Oh, yeah, I've heard of that. It's about fixing up those little problems, like graffiti, to prevent bigger crimes, right?
Right. The idea is that if you let those little things go, it creates an environment where bigger crimes are more likely to happen.
So cleaning up the streets actually helps reduce crime overall.
Exactly. And it seemed to work in New York. Okay, what about another example, something a little more techie?
Okay, yeah, hit me with it.
CCTV cameras in public spaces. They can be controversial, but they definitely deter crime, especially in places like parking garages or ATMs.
Yeah, it makes sense. People are less likely to do something bad if they know they're being watched. Okay, what about those community programs we talked about? Do they really work?
There's this program called Cure Violence that's been pretty successful. It treats violence like a disease, something that can spread.
That's interesting.
Yeah, they use outreach workers and people who've been involved in violence themselves to try to stop it from spreading.
So, like, breaking that cycle of violence.
Exactly. And it's been working in a lot of places. Okay, I think we've covered a lot today. What are some of the main things we should take away from all this?
Yeah, that's a lot to process.
Well, the biggest thing is that victims aren't chosen randomly. There are reasons, both individual and societal.
So we need to be aware of those reasons, understand our own vulnerabilities.
Exactly. And remember that preventing crime is everyone's responsibility, not just the police.
Right. It takes a village, as they say.
Yeah.
Okay, so we need to understand how victims are chosen and work together to stop it. But what about timing? Does that play a role too?
Timing is definitely a factor. It's amazing how much the when of a crime can tell us.
Okay, I'm intrigued. So how does timing play into all of this?
Well, it can be about opportunity, or maybe when someone's most vulnerable, or even just that one moment when everything lines up in a bad way.
Okay, that makes sense. So let's start with the obvious. Time of day. Everyone knows more crimes happen at night, right?
That's right. Criminals love the cover of darkness. It's harder to see, easier to get away. It's not surprising that a lot of violent crimes, like assaults and robberies, happen when it's dark out.
Yeah, makes sense. We're all a little more jumpy when we can't see as well. But what about other patterns? Does predictability play a role?
Oh, absolutely. Think about routines. We all have them, right? And criminals know that. They might watch someone, learn their schedule, and figure out when they're most vulnerable.
So it's like a predator stalking its prey, waiting for the right moment to strike.
Exactly. It could be walking home alone at night, leaving work early in the morning, or even taking the same route to the store every week.
Wow, that's a little creepy, honestly. Just doing our normal things can make us targets.
It's true. That's why it's good to mix things up, change your routes, and just be aware of those patterns.
Okay, good advice. But what about those times when it's not so predictable? Those moments when something unexpected happens and makes us vulnerable?
Right, like those big life changes. moving to a new city, a breakup, losing your job. Those can make people more emotionally vulnerable and less aware of what's going on around them.
So those times of stress and change can make us easier targets.
Exactly. And it's not just emotional. Those changes can mess up your routines, your support system.
Hmm.
You can end up feeling isolated, and that makes you vulnerable.
It's like everything we've been talking about comes together in those moments.
Yeah.
Okay, what about big events? Concerts, festivals, things like
Oh,
that.
yeah. Those can be risky, too. Lots of people. Everyone's distracted. It's easy to blend in. Criminals love those kinds of events.
It's like a smorgasbord for pickpockets and thieves.
Right. And it's not just petty theft either. Those crowds can create opportunities for more serious crimes, too.
That's a good reminder to always be aware of your surroundings, even when you're having fun.
Exactly. Okay, so we've talked about time of day, routines, big life changes, events. But there's one more layer to this: historical context.
Okay, you're going to have to explain that one. How does history play a role in all of this?
Well, crime doesn't just happen in a vacuum, right? It's all tied to what's going on in the world around us. The
Yeah.
social stuff, the economics, even politics.
So are you saying that history can predict who's going to be a victim?
Not predict exactly, but it can show us how patterns of victimization change over time, how certain groups become targets during certain periods.
Okay, I think I'm starting to get it. Can you give me some examples?
Sure, think about the Salem witch trials. It was a time when fear and superstition were running wild, and innocent people, mostly women, were accused of witchcraft.
Yeah, that was a dark time in history. But how does that relate to timing?
Well, those trials happened during a period of huge social and political upheaval. It created this perfect storm for that kind of mass hysteria.
Okay, so the timing made those accusations more believable, more likely to be acted upon.
Exactly. People were scared and looking for someone to blame. Okay, let's jump to a different era. The Jim Crow era in the South.
Oh man, that was a horrible time for Black Americans. So much violence and injustice.
It was. And a lot of that violence, the lynchings especially, happened during specific events like economic downturns or when politicians were using racial fears to get votes.
So again, the timing played a role, making those acts of violence more likely.
Right. Those events created a climate where that kind of hatred and violence could flourish. Okay, let's bring it a little closer to home, the time after 9/11.
Yeah, there was a lot of fear and anger after those attacks, unfortunately.
There was. And we saw a huge increase in hate crimes against Muslims and people who looked like they might be from the Middle East.
That's so sad, just because of how they looked or what they believed in.
It's awful, but it shows how even in modern times, fear and prejudice can lead to violence. And understanding those patterns from history and today can help us stop them from happening again.
Okay, so timing is important, both in those specific moments and in the bigger picture of history. What should we remember about all this?
Well, the biggest thing is that timing is rarely just a coincidence. Criminals often plan things very carefully.
So it's not just being in the wrong place at the wrong time, it's about understanding that criminals often choose those times on purpose.
Exactly. And that's why being aware of your surroundings is so important. Pay attention to where you are, who's around you, and trust your gut if something feels off.
Okay, that makes sense. But criminals can also try to manipulate the timing, right? Like tricking someone into being somewhere at a certain time.
Absolutely. They might try to lure someone, create a distraction, or just take advantage of a moment when someone's not paying attention. And that brings us to this idea of accessibility.
Accessibility, okay, explain that one to me.
Think of it as how easy it is for a criminal to get to their victim. It's like the last piece of the puzzle. Psychology, geography, social dynamics, timing, they all come together in that moment of access.
So what makes someone accessible to a criminal?
Yeah.
It's not just about being physically close.
Right. It's more complicated than that. It's about physical things, social things, and even psychological things all mixed together.
Okay, let's break it down. What are some of the physical things that make someone more accessible?
Well, think about the location. Isolated areas, dark streets, neighborhoods with lots of crime. Those all create an environment where a victim is more exposed.
It's like those places give the criminal a sense of anonymity and leave the victim with no protection.
Exactly. And then there are things about the location itself that make it easy to sneak up on someone or get away quickly.
Like bushes to hide behind, or no street lights, or nowhere to run to.
Yeah, all of that. And if there are no witnesses around, that makes it even easier for a criminal.
Okay, that makes sense. So location is a big one. What about social things? How do our relationships or lack of relationships play into this?
Well, If someone's isolated, doesn't have many friends or family, or is always moving around, they're more accessible because there's no one looking out for them.
It's like those social connections we talked about before. They create a safety net.
Exactly. And then there's how society views certain people or groups.
You mean like stereotypes and prejudices?
Yeah, it's sad, but some people are seen as less important, less deserving of protection, and that can make them targets.
That's so true. It's like those inequalities we talked about earlier. They play a role in all of this.
They do, and that's why it's so important to fight against those biases and create a society where everyone is respected and treated equally.
Okay, so we've got the physical stuff,
Hmm.
the social stuff. What about psychology? Can our mental state make us more vulnerable?
Definitely. Think about those traits we discussed before. Low self-esteem, past trauma, being submissive. Those can make someone a target because they might not be as assertive or might be easier to manipulate.
It's like they're unintentionally sending out a signal that they're an easy target.
Unfortunately, that's how some criminals see it. That's why it's so important to work on your confidence, set boundaries, and learn to stand up for yourself.
Right, those are all important life skills anyway. But they can actually help protect you from crime, too.
Exactly. And it's not just personality traits. Situational things can play a role too.
Like if someone's drunk or distracted or in a place they don't know.
Yeah, all of those things can make you less aware of your surroundings and more vulnerable.
It's a good reminder that anyone can be a target, no matter how confident they usually are. Okay, so we've covered a lot, but we have to talk about technology again. It has to play a role in accessibility, right?
Oh, huge. The digital age has created this whole new level of accessibility.
Because now it's not just about physical location anymore. It's about being online.
Exactly. Anyone with an internet connection can be a potential victim now. And that means more potential victims for criminals and more ways for them to target people.
Okay, this is starting to sound pretty scary.
Mm.
How has technology changed how criminals find their victims?
Well, think about social media. It's great for connecting with people, but it also gives criminals a ton of information.
Yeah, we put so much out there. Where we live, our routines, what we like, what we're afraid of. It's like we're creating a profile for a criminal to use.
That's a good way to put it. And it's not just what we post on purpose. Our online activity, all that data, can tell a story even if we're trying to be careful.
So we need to be really careful about what we do online.
Mm,
But how? It's hard to keep track of everything.
it is. But the main thing is to think before you post. Don't share personal details like your address or phone number. Be careful about posting your routines or travel plans.
So it's about setting boundaries online, just like we do in real life.
Exactly. And be careful who you connect with, especially on dating apps and social media.
Oh yeah, that's a good point. And those privacy settings, they're important too, right?
Huge. Take the time to go through those settings on all your accounts and make sure you're only sharing what you want with who you want. And always use strong passwords.
Okay, so we have to be our own digital bodyguards, basically. But what about when we're offline, in the real world? What if we feel threatened?
Always trust your gut. If someone's making you feel uncomfortable, get away from them, online or offline. And don't be afraid to report it to the police if you need to.
Right. Better safe than sorry. Okay, so we've talked about understanding the risks, but what about empowering potential victims? It's not just about knowing the dangers, it's about knowing how to protect yourself.
Exactly. It's about giving people the tools and knowledge to take control of their own safety.
Okay, I like that. So how do we do that? How do we empower people?
Education is key. We need to teach people about how victims are chosen, the warning signs, and the strategies they can use to stay safe.
So basically spreading awareness and giving people the information they need to make good choices.
Exactly. But it's not just about information, it's about giving people practical skills too.
So things like self-defense classes or learning how to be more assertive.
Yep, those can give people the confidence to defend themselves, both physically and verbally.
What about people who are targeted because of who they are, like their race or religion? How do we help them?
That's a big one. We need to create a society where everyone feels safe and accepted, no matter who they are. And we need to support marginalized communities, encourage them to report hate crimes, and make sure they have access to the help they need.
So it's about creating a world where everyone is treated with respect and dignity.
Exactly. And it's a responsibility we all share.
Well, I think we've covered a lot in this deep dive. We talked about how victims are chosen, how to prevent crime, and how to empower people to protect themselves. It's a lot to think about, but it's important stuff.
It is. And I hope our listeners feel a little more informed and a little more prepared now.
I hope so too. Knowledge is power, and in this case, it can literally save lives. So stay safe out there, everyone.